How many times have you felt that there's something wrong inside you, but you don't know exactly what? You have everything that should make you happy: a good job, a family, a stable routine, and yet there's an invisible hole, a nameless pain that insists on staying with you. According to the World Health Organization, more than 970 million people in the world live with a mental disorder. And many of these people, perhaps you, perhaps someone close to you, don't know that they are trapped in a cycle generated by an old trauma. A trauma that wasn't caused by a war or an accident. It's caused by something more subtle: the absence of a welcome, the silence of childhood, the weight of never having been truly heard. Gabor Maté, one of the leading experts on trauma and addiction, says that don't ask why addiction, ask why pain. And Carl Jung, decades earlier, already talked about the shadow, rejected parts of ourselves that end up running our lives in the shadows, while we pretend to be in control. In this video, we're going to dive into this pain that nobody sees, but which shapes everything. We'll understand how silent traumas turn into addictions, how denying suffering distances us from our essence, and how Jung's philosophy and Maté's compassion can guide us on the path to healing. There is a kind of pain that doesn't scream. It doesn't show up in tests. It doesn't come up in everyday conversations. But it eats away at you, day after day. It's the kind of pain that turns into constant tiredness, irritation for no reason, a lack of pleasure in life. A pain that many call emptiness. But it actually has a name. It's trauma. Only a silent trauma. You may never have suffered great violence. You've never faced a war, a disaster, or a visible tragedy. But maybe you grew up in a home where feelings weren't talked about, where love came with conditions, where you had to be strong too soon or invisible to survive. That kind of environment doesn't leave visible scars, but it deeply marks the soul. And that's where the hole begins, a hole you try to fill with everything: work, food, relationships, shopping, control, distractions. But it never closes. This emptiness is not laziness, weakness, or lack of gratitude. It's the echo of unmet emotional needs. Gabor Maté explains that trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside you as a result of what happened. In other words, it's not just what was done to you. It's what you had to repress, hide, swallow in order to go on living. It's the love you never received as you needed it, the presence that never came, the welcome that was lacking. And then a cruel paradox arises. The more you try to ignore this emptiness, the more it screams. But it doesn't scream with words, it screams with behavior. You sabotage yourself, procrastinate, get involved in empty relationships, or live in anesthesia. You know that tiredness that won't go away, that feeling of always being one step behind? It could be trauma manifesting itself. Carl Jung said that what we deny in ourselves controls us from the shadows. The emptiness that dwells within you is not an enemy. It is a messenger. It doesn't want to be fought. It wants to be listened to. It wants you to look with courage at what you had to bury in order to survive. And that's why so many people live disconnected from themselves. Because we've been taught to run away from pain, not to understand it. But while we run away, it runs our lives without us realizing it. Not every trauma comes with blood. Not every wound needs a cut to exist. There is pain that hides behind social smiles, behind lives that appear to be well resolved, traumas that disguise themselves as independence, productivity, and success. But inside, they scream, silently. Gabor Maté says that most of our emotional suffering is not born out of dramatic events, but out of what didn't happen. The affection that was missing, the touch that never came, the I love you that was never said. This is what he calls the trauma of omission, a pain that doesn't lie in what happened, but in what was missing. And the most dangerous thing is that this kind of trauma becomes normalized. We grew up in homes where silence was mistaken for peace, where being obedient was more important than being listened to, where the child who needed to be held was called weak. And then, without realizing it, that child learned to keep quiet, to hide their emotions so as not to disturb them, to anesthetize themselves in order to survive. The problem? This pattern continues into adulthood. The pain is still there, unhealed, just buried by commitments, goals, and routines. Invisible traumas form adults who live on automatic, people who can't rest even when they're exhausted, people who feel guilty for saying no, who feel inadequate even though they are competent. This is because the wounded child inside us still seeks approval. It still fears rejection. It still hopes deep down that someone will come along and validate us. But nobody does. And so we try to fill this hole on our own, with distractions and addictions. Carl Jung would say that the unconscious is like a safe. Everything we repress goes there, but nothing really disappears. Sooner or later, the contents of this vault leak out, in bouts of anxiety, outbursts of anger, emotional breakdowns. When the soul isn't listened to, it makes the body sick. That's why we need to relearn to listen to the subtle signs of pain. The tightness in the chest, the restrained crying, the insomnia, the disconnection with others. These are not weaknesses, they are alarms. Invisible trauma is not your fault. It's an intelligent response by your body and mind trying to protect you from a pain that, at the time, was unbearable. Only now, as an adult, you have the tools to look at it more clearly. It takes courage to recognize that you're hurt. But it is this courage that opens the door to true transformation. When we talk about addiction, most people think of drugs, alcohol, or cigarettes. But addiction goes much deeper than that. There is addiction to control, to pleasing, to work, to food, to social networks, addiction to destructive relationships, addiction to cheap dopamine. These are all ways of running away from yourself. Gabor Maté is clear. Every addiction is an attempt to relieve pain. And that pain most often stems from unacknowledged trauma. The pain of feeling invisible, inadequate, rejected. The pain of not feeling worthy of love just for existing. Addiction then comes in as a momentary relief. It offers what was missing: comfort, distraction, welcome, albeit false and fleeting. Imagine someone who, in childhood, only received attention when they got good grades. That child grew up believing that they only deserved affection if they were productive. And today, as an adult, they work compulsively. She can't rest. She feels guilty when she stops. She's addicted to productivity because it's the only way she knows to feel worthwhile. But nobody calls it an addiction, because invisible addictions are socially accepted. They're even praised. Carl Jung warned us about this. He said that what we don't face in ourselves, we will find as destiny. In other words, if we don't face our inner emptiness, we create automatic escape mechanisms. And the more we run away, the more dependent we become on these mechanisms. The problem is that addiction never resolves the pain, it only postpones it. And over time, it makes us slaves to what should only be a passing relief. A man who drinks every night isn't just looking for alcohol. He seeks silence for the inner voices that accuse him. He's trying to forget what he can't face. A woman who can't stay single may not be addicted to love, but to not feeling alone, because when she's alone, the pain comes out. These behaviors are masks. They are attempts at protection, but they are also prisons, and society often reinforces these prisons. It applauds the hyperproductive, romanticizes the help addict, praises the warrior who never stops. But inside, these people are exhausted, and they don't know why. Addiction is not the enemy, it's the symptom. The real enemy is the unheard pain. And as long as we treat only the behavior without listening to the emotional root, we will remain trapped. Carl Jung said that until you become conscious, the unconscious will direct your life, and you will call it destiny. This simple and powerful phrase sums up one of the most profound ideas in Jungian psychology: the shadow. And it is precisely in the shadow that many of our vices, impulses, and sabotages hide. The shadow, according to Jung, is everything we have been forced to repress. It's the part of us that hasn't been accepted, loved, or recognized. It could be your sensitivity, your anger, your desire, your fragility. Any emotion that, at some point, was considered wrong, shameful, or dangerous. In order to survive emotionally, you had to hide these aspects in the basement of your psyche. But they haven't disappeared. They're still alive and kicking behind the scenes. And here's the key point. Everything we deny, ignore, or reject in ourselves eventually finds a way of expressing itself, usually in a dysfunctional way. Addiction is often that crooked expression. You don't allow yourself to cry, so you numb yourself. You don't feel worthy of affection, so you cling to those who hurt you. You can't admit you're lost, so you pretend you're always busy. And so the shadow silently runs your life. True healing begins when we stop running away from pain and decide to face it. And this confrontation is not a war, it's a reunion. It's looking inwards and asking, what inside me has been abandoned? What did I have to hide in order to be accepted? Jung called this process shadow integration. He believed that by recognizing and accepting these forgotten parts, we become more whole, more human, and above all, freer. Because when you embrace your anger, it doesn't have to explode. When you recognize your sadness, it doesn't have to make your body sick. When you accept your fragility, it stops embarrassing you. This is a painful path. It requires humility. It requires the courage to admit that you are not as in control as you thought. But it is also a path of liberation, because we can only truly choose when we know what drives us. Otherwise, we'll just be puppets of our untreated wounds. The shadow is not a monster. It is the part of you that most needs light, and the more you push it away, the more it dominates your life between the lines. Have you ever noticed how certain patterns seem to repeat themselves in your life? Relationships that start differently but end the same way. The feeling of always being stuck in the same kind of frustration, even after changing cities, jobs, or partners. This is no coincidence. It's trauma trying to resolve itself. But because we don't listen to it, it persists, until we are forced to listen to it. Gabor Maté says that untreated trauma manifests itself as a cycle. It comes back, not because we are weak or incapable, but because there is still something inside us that needs to be understood. And as long as we don't understand it, we repeat it. Jung said something similar. We don't live our lives, we are lived by our complexes. In other words, our automatic reactions, impulsive choices, and addictions are not random. They are emotional responses programmed by old wounds, many of them from childhood. Think of someone who grew up with a cold and emotionally distant father. This person, even unconsciously, tends to be attracted to partners who make them feel exactly the same way. This is because the psyche tries, in a symbolic way, to correct what has been poorly resolved. It repeats the scenario, hoping for a different outcome. But without awareness, the ending is always the same. Pain. It's like a play with a fixed script. Only the characters change. The one who has been ignored repeats the cycle of abandonment. The one who was devalued attracts those who don't recognize her. The one who was forced to be strong doesn't know how to ask for help. And so we go on, loving as we have been loved, suffering as we have been hurt. This repetition is not punishment. It's a request, an appeal from the unconscious saying, "Look at me." But we're so afraid of the original pain that we'd rather repeat the trauma than face it head on. Until one day, the suffering becomes too great to ignore. It's at this point that many collapse emotionally. But it's also at this point that healing begins. Healing begins when you decide to break the cycle, when you choose to react differently, when you realize that you no longer need to follow the script you've been given. And this is only possible when you become aware of your history. When, instead of running away from the pain, you listen to it. When, instead of blaming yourself for the patterns, you investigate them with compassion. You are not the trauma you experienced, but it lives in you until you transform it. And this transformation begins with awareness, but is realized with action. Pain that is not listened to is repeated. Trauma that we don't recognize commands us. But when we decide, with courage, to look inwards, we begin a healing movement that changes everything, and that begins in silence. A different kind of silence, not one of repression, but one of listening. A silence that welcomes, not hides. Gabor Maté says that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. Connection with yourself, with your emotions, with your story. with your truth. And Jung adds, only what we really are has the power to heal us. Healing, therefore, does not lie in denying the past, but in integrating it. Not in erasing the pain, but in allowing it to reveal who you have become and who you can still be. The first step is awareness. Name the pain, recognizing the patterns, assuming that addiction is a legitimate response to something that, at some point, was unbearable to feel. And here, a lot of compassion is needed. Self-criticism doesn't heal. Judgment only deepens the wound. What heals is acceptance. The second step is emotional expression. This can happen in therapy, in safe conversations, in writing, art, or spirituality. The important thing is to let the pain come out, safely. Not to drown you, but to free you. Because what has been repressed needs to be said. What has been hidden needs to be illuminated. The third step is internal repositioning. Stop being the victim of your own story and become the protagonist. This doesn't mean ignoring what has been suffered. It means giving it new meaning. It means saying to yourself, I had no choice in what hurt me, but I now have a choice in what I do with it. And no, this healing is not linear. It has relapses, doubts, grey days. But over time, you begin to realize the hole no longer hurts so much. The repetitions diminish. Relationships become truer, and the addiction loses strength because you no longer have to run away from yourself. This path requires courage, but also surrender. And you don't have to walk it alone. Therapy, support groups, reading, spirituality, all of these can be part of this reconstruction. But the most important thing is your decision to no longer live anesthetized, to live with presence, with truth, with soul. Carl Jung said that the encounter with oneself is the most frightening of all, but it is also the most liberating. Silent trauma doesn't have to keep driving your life. The first step is awareness. The second is choice. And if you've come this far, it's because you already have that strength inside you. The will to break cycles, to reconnect, to live more truthfully. Type, I'm ready if you're ready to be healed. If this content has touched something deep in you, like the video, it helps YouTube deliver it to more people who also need to hear this message. And if you believe that this kind of content makes a difference in the world, consider leaving a support of any amount here on the channel. Just as addiction is born out of a lack of connection, this channel only exists because there are people willing to connect with this message. See you in the next video. And until then, listen to what your soul is trying to tell you.